All right. So let me just tell you about study groups. And first, I'll tell you the why behind the what. I am a very social person, and I found that the law school environment was not the most ideal environment for my learning style. Prior to law school, I was a corporate trainer, and prior to that, I was a TV reporter for a CBS affiliate. So I love people, love being out and about with people. I love teaching. I love being in a classroom. I love public speaking. And so in law school, it can be very isolating. You can spend a lot of time we had these desks at our law school called carrels. And, if you're not careful, you can spend, 6 to 8 hours a day just at your carrel alone, reading and typing up some notes for yourself. And then you go to some classes and they help break things up. And, those can be really interesting and a little bit more engaging, and you might participate. You might, get called on and have a little bit of the Socratic method experience, or you might volunteer your hand, engage that way. And so the in-class experience for me at law school was awesome. I always loved it. But the traditional sit down and look at a book and study in isolation the whole time, when you're outside a classroom, that was not working out for me. And, I had heard about study groups prior, and people had recommended study groups, but the traditional study group model just didn't seem like a really good fit for me, because I had a lot to juggle. I had, I still have, I've got some kids. I had 3 kids when I graduated from law school. I had jobs that I was trying to do, not so much my first year of law school, but I had lots of jobs my second and third year to provide for my family. So my wife could stay home with the kids. And so, and I also had some community responsibilities, some service opportunities in my church and things like that. So I've got all these things to juggle. And the last thing I wanted, even though the traditional way of studying on your own is kind of isolating, the last thing I wanted was another thing on my to-do list that wouldn't necessarily translate to better grades or better job prospects. And so the idea of doing a study group at first, I shied away from, because my understanding of traditional study groups was you get together after the fact. You've done the reading, you've prepared for class, and you get together and you just talk about what you read. You kind of debate doctrines, you talk policies. And while that's all good and awesome, if you're in a pinch when it comes to time, it's something that wasn't appealing to me, even though I thought it would be a lot of fun to do that kind of thing. I just didn't have the time for that. Like, I needed a study group that would save me time and cut out some of that traditional, sit down, stare at the book, and prepare for class time, so I could keep my life in balance. And so I got this idea for a different type of study group that wasn't so much about debating doctrines and getting together and just chatting organically and in my mind inefficiently, and instead created a new system that I found to be really successful. Everybody that I approached with this idea at first, well, when I walked up to them, I didn't know these people. I mean, they were classmates. I didn't know if they'd be good students. I knew really nothing about them. I just approached 6 random people, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about starting a study group. I'm thinking this is kind of the methodology I want to use with this study group. I know that sounds kind of weird and different, but if you could just join for like a 2-week trial period and see how you like it, and if you don't like it, you can quit my study group. That was the offer I put, and all 6 of these people I approached said, yeah, sure, yeah, why not? I don't have a study group, and that sounds interesting. We can give it a try. And so I got all these random people together with me, and we tried this new methodology. And after the 2 weeks, every single one of them stayed on. And we actually had more people join our group too. It didn't get crazy big. I think we maxed out about 8 people in our group, and which ended up being really, really helpful. At first, I didn't think that would be the ideal size, but for me, it ended up working out well. So you're probably wondering, okay, so what was the study group actually like? How is it different than more traditional study groups? I'll explain. I'll try to explain as quickly as I can, because this is just one part of the stuff I'd like to cover today. So in a nutshell, there's this concept of dividing and conquering the different classwork you need to do, returning and reporting, so teaching, and ultimately saving time and getting better results. The way we worked it out is we had 3 core classes that we were all in together. We all had torts, we all had contracts, and we all had property. And what we would do is we would rotate every week who would be the expert, or actually the experts, because we had 2 for each subject area. And what the experts would do is, instead of just reading the case law for themselves, they would read it with their study group in mind and with teaching in mind. So they actually had to do a little bit more reading, and they'd have to do a lot more careful note taking, because everybody else in the study group would be relying on their notes. The reason we had 2 experts for each subject on each week was that we have kind of an internal audit system, basically the safety net, where every single class we would go in with 2 sets of notes from 2 different perspectives from students who had prepared very thoroughly. And so I found this to be super beneficial and also a time saver. And I'll talk about a bunch of the benefits, but one of them was this: if you're just studying for yourself, you might start out in law school just really gung-ho, really on the ball, reading cases very critically and carefully and taking great notes. But after a couple weeks, it's more than likely that it's going to devolve to some skimming, basic survival mode. You might start having some papers, some memos or briefs due, and those will encroach on your traditional, coursework. And you might look for some commercial, case briefs online, and those can be a little bit more superficial, and they certainly don't cover the notes in between the cases that your particular casebook might have. And I had a professor that really hammered those post-case notes that weren't part of the case, I think in part to see if we were actually, quote, doing the reading. And so what I liked about this method is, on the weeks when I was the expert for a subject, I never skimmed. Like, I never got into any bad habits. Anytime I read cases, I read them very critically because my team was relying on me. And I also took very exact and detailed notes because I knew my study group was relying on me. And so I actually think this study group model made me a more critical case reader and a better attorney when I graduated. And so we kept this rotation where every week you'd be an expert for a different subject. So that subject area, no particular subject area would get too foreign for you, right? The furthest you'd go without reading a case would be a couple weeks. You'd have, you do torts one week, next week you do contracts, next week you do property. And actually, when our study group grew just a touch, we had a couple extra people, and what we were able to do is have a week off of being an expert about once every month-ish, which was really good and helped with other assignments like our briefs, memos, and things that we had at the law school that I attended. And so when you were a non-expert for a subject, what you would do is 2 things. One, you would read 2 sets of thorough notes, ideally the night before a class. I mean, there's lots of research about, memory and things like that, but you certainly get more bang for your buck if you study right before bed, because it's in your head, it's kind of digesting as you sleep. And so what I would do is just, the 40 minutes or so before I went to bed, I would read over 2 sets of notes for, say, contracts, if I'm not the expert in contracts a week, and then I'd read 2 sets of notes for property if I was the non-expert for that. So say it's my torts week. So I do really thorough reading and note-taking for torts. That would take me longer than usual, longer than if I just did it on my own, right? Because people are relying on me. But then I save time on these other subjects because in the course of 20 minutes, I could read through 2 sets of notes for that subject. And so I spent about 40 minutes before bed, just read over those 2 sets of notes. And it was always interesting because you'd get a lot of similarities between the notes, but you'd also catch some nuances. Sometimes there'd be some ambiguities, some things that you'd have questions about. And so what would you do with those? Well, 20 minutes before each class, regardless of whether you are an expert or a non-expert, we'd get together as the study group. And if you were a non-expert, you could ask questions of the experts. And if you were an expert, then you could, enjoy that time teaching and further cementing what you had read and what you learned and what you communicated through your great notes you'd have the opportunity to cement that knowledge by educating your group. And so everybody in our study group had opportunities to teach, had opportunities to ask questions. It was crazy how often the questions that we had ended up being the types of questions that our professors would ask in class. And it would be so refreshing to be like, oh, we just talked about that. You know, my lips are actually used to talking about that particular concept. And it took a lot of the fear and anxiety out of the classroom experience. And I don't believe that any professors ever suspected that we didn't, you know, do the reading, at least in the traditional sense. I mean, we certainly were well prepared, and I would argue more prepared than we would have been had we not used this model. And so if you look at, you know, the entire model, yes, you're spending more time when you're an expert, but that time is meaningful because you're using that time to basically serve, you know, other people in your study group and to teach them to practice critical reading and comprehensive, detailed, accurate note-taking, because they're relying on you and you don't want the other guy's notes to be like way better than yours. So it wasn't really a competitive aspect, but it was a check on each of us, knowing that we weren't the only people doing the notes, and we wanted to make sure that people knew that we would, you know, tow our fair share of the load. But in the subjects where you're non-expert, I mean, you spent 20 minutes reading over some notes, and you spent 20 minutes before class. And both of those experiences for me were really enjoyable, especially the 20 minutes before class. And then occasionally, because our group was so big, we had some weeks off where we could focus on other things. And so I felt like I averaged, you know, I didn't keep critical or super detailed, specific track of how many hours I was at law school because I'm not that OCD. But I think on average, I did about 30, 35, maybe 37 hours of law school stuff a week, which gave me ample time to take care of my family, to pursue extracurricular type things, and then on my second, third tier, you know, work and build my network with potential employers. And so that's a little bit about the model that we use. And I apologize, I could have clicked a little bit sooner on some of this, but this is just rehashing what I just explained to you. So you get this opportunity to read 2 sets of notes, 20 minutes the night before, 20 minute before class, ask questions and review. And for whatever your assigned subject is, whatever you're the expert in, you read thoroughly, take awesome notes, right? Because folks are relying on you. After this study group went so well, my law school actually found out about it, and they invited me to present to 1Ls and actually 0Ls a couple times on the model. And so I don't think professors are turned off by this approach. I know sometimes people will be like, oh, you gotta do all the reading, like you don't want to be lazy, but it's about working smarter, not necessarily working in a more time consuming way. And the friendships I created in my study group, I mean, they've been lifelong. And actually tomorrow I'm flying to Canada to go to a wedding of one of my buddies in the study group. And I think 6 out of the 8 of us are all flying to Canada for the wedding, which is crazy, or driving. A couple of them took a big trip like through Yellowstone and things like that. And so that's how tight knit we are. Like we laughed together, we cried together. They're some of my very best friends. And so that was another benefit of using a study group, and using a study group like this where you could really give and take. And it's been fun to kind of see where everybody is wound up. I've got a friend from my study group that's working for the FBI. I've got one who right out of law school went to this huge firm in London, you know, making $270,000 a year, which is insane for fresh out of law school. You know, I've got one friend that went into legal aid, one that's working in a tech company. There's me, you know, founding a bar prep company and doing some other things, and, you know, some more traditional, small, mid-sized firm. Got one who's just killing it in real estate. And so we got a great variety, you know, in our study group, and that was nice because it gave us some great perspective. And when you become really good friends with your classmates, I think it helps you chill out a little bit when it comes to the curve and the competitive aspect. I remember thinking, you know what, these guys are awesome, and I would not be embarrassed if any of them outperform me on grades, because that's how highly I think of my classmates. And it was really fun to see how we ended up doing, as a study group. This model worked really well the first year because we were all in the same classes. Second and third year, not so much, because everybody's in different classes. There's a lot more choice, at least at the law school that I went to. But it was interesting to see, in the first year when we were using this model, almost across the board, everybody outperformed themselves academically than when they were flying solo after, or more solo. I mean, we still use the model, and in some cases, maybe we just create a mini study group for one class, and so we'd rotate, just for that class, and you could just team up with 3 other people and rotate every other week who's doing the reading, or 6 or 5 other people and rotate every 3 weeks.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.